Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, March 29th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The Senate rejects a special watchdog for Ukraine. So the Senate on Tuesday night voted down an amendment to create a special inspector general to oversee the over $113 billion that the US has authorized to spend on the war in Ukraine. The amendment, which was introduced by Senator Josh Hawley, failed in a vote of 26 to 68. 24 Republicans and only 2 Democrats voted in favor of more oversight for the billions in weapons that are being shipped to Ukraine. So Hawley tried to add this amendment to a bill to repeal the 1991 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force, and that legislation is expected to be voted on sometime this week. So Hawley's idea was to create a position for Ukraine similar to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, which is John Sopko. He's filled that role since 2012. And as the Inspector General, he found tens of billions of dollars in waste in US aid to Afghanistan of just, the amounts that he was looking at. And he issued just a lot of reports really criticizing the US policy. So, I guess putting him in that position didn't change things in Afghanistan really, but at least, it gave more transparency. And, there's no arguing that anything the US was doing in Afghanistan was good. So I think something for Ukraine like that might be pretty illuminating. But unfortunately, not enough people in Congress want that. And Sobko recently, I mentioned some quotes of his from in yesterday's show about comparing Afghanistan to Ukraine. I just put in another quote. This was from him last month talking about Ukraine. He said, quote, "You're bound to get corrupt elements of not only the Ukrainian or the host government, but also of US government contractors or other third-party contractors to try to steal the money. There's just so much money going in and it's hard to keep track of," end quote. So he's basically saying it's inevitable when you're talking about this kind of money that things are going to be skimmed off the top, weapons are going to end up on the black market, and we know there's been some signs that there are weapons out there in the world that the US and the West shipped into Ukraine. The president of Nigeria said that terrorists in the Lake Chad region were ending up with these weapons. So ahead of Tuesday's vote, Hawley wrote in an op-ed published by Fox News, quote, "Billions upon billions of American dollars are pouring into a war-torn country without any serious oversight," end quote. Unfortunately, with Hawley, he is critical of the U.S. policy in Ukraine, but that's because he thinks we should be pouring billions of dollars worth of weapons into Taiwan instead and focus on building up in the Asia Pacific to face China. In December, he actually sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken telling him to prioritize arming Taiwan over Ukraine. He said, hey, these Javelin and Stinger missiles that we're sending to Ukraine, let's get them over to Taiwan instead. So that's what he's about. But unfortunately, it would have been good to get a special inspector general for Ukraine. I think I don't think this will be the last of this effort. Even some of the hawks in Congress are coming out in favor of oversight. So unfortunately, they're going to try to use it to justify more U.S. military involvement in the war. We know that there are U.S. military personnel based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, but they're going out into the field to conduct weapons inspections. And that could always increase. The Pentagon could send more troops in the name of, oversight. So that's always a risk with this too. All right, the next one here. The UN Security Council will not probe the Nord Stream bombing. So the UN Security Council voted Monday against a Russian effort to get an independent investigation into the bombings of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia to Germany. So the only members of the council that voted in favor of the resolution were Russia, China, and Brazil. The remaining 12 members abstained from the vote, including the United States, which, of course, is the most likely culprit of the attacks. And the resolution, it didn't really have much of a chance of passing since in the UN Security Council, it needs at least 9 votes in favor and no veto from any of the 5 permanent members, which is the US, China, Russia, Britain, and France. I would guess if somehow 9 other members did vote in favor of this, the US and the UK would have vetoed it anyway. But Russia has been pushing for an international inquiry into the Nord Stream sabotage, more so since the Seymour Hersh report came out in February that said President Biden ordered the bombings. And of course, the US has denied responsibility for the bombing. And the New York Times recently published a story that claimed US officials now believe a pro-Ukrainian group might be responsible for the sabotage. A very, very, very vague story, and that didn't make much sense. And according to Hersh, he had a follow-up on that, and sources told him that this new narrative in the New York Times was actually planted by the CIA, who was ordered to concoct this cover story after President Biden met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz earlier this month. All right, the next one here. This is from Kyle over at the Libertarian Institute. The U.S. to withhold nuclear weapons data from Russia. So the White House announced on Tuesday that it will cease sending the Kremlin data on its nuclear weapons. Under the New START treaty, the U.S. and Russia agreed to share the information, but Moscow has suspended its involvement in the agreement as relations with Washington have deteriorated. So National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters that the White House made the decision as Russia is in violation of the treaty. They're not really in violation of the treaty. They've just said that they suspended their participation. The Joe Biden administration believes that the move will push Moscow to return to compliance with the New START treaty. So Kirby said, quote, as a lawful countermeasure intended to encourage Russia to return to compliance with the treaty, the United States will likewise not provide its biannual data update to Russia. The United States informed Russia in advance of this step in the interest of strategic stability. The United States will continue to promote public transparency on our nuclear force levels and posture, end quote. Kirby said that Moscow was no longer sharing nuclear data with the U.S., which I guess that is a violation of the treaty, but I know Russia has said they're not going to change the levels because the New START limits the deployment of warheads and bombers and ICBMs and things like that. And Russia has said for now they're not going to change those levels. They're not going to increase those deployments. So Sergei Lavrov, he seemed to contradict Kirby. This is the Russian foreign minister, saying that there has been no contact with the U.S. on the New START treaty. So Russia officially suspended its participation in the New START on March 1st, but the Kremlin says that it will continue to comply with the nuclear weapons caps set per the agreement. So hopefully that sticks, that both sides keep, tacitly, fulfilling this treaty when it comes to the caps that it puts on the deployments. And the New START treaty is the last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia. So it's just the state of things. It's just a really bad situation that there's no active nuclear arms control between the world's 2 largest nuclear powers while the U.S. is, funding this proxy war right on Russia's border. Very concerning. All right, the next one here. Ukrainian troops seen with depleted uranium ammunition in the UK. So this is from Declassified UK. Ukrainian soldiers have been filmed alongside depleted uranium and ammunition that Britain is supplying to their country for the fight against Russia. The footage is contained in a documentary the UK Ministry of Defense released yesterday as Ukrainian tank crews completed their training. Britain is gifting 14 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, together with depleted uranium shells. As Declassified revealed last week, a Ministry of Defense spokesperson told the media that, quote, the impact to personal health and the environment from the use of depleted uranium munitions is likely to be low, end quote. So I know when it comes to the fact that depleted uranium causes cancer and birth defects, I think there's a lot of like US funded studies out there that try to say that they don't cause that. So that's I'm sure that the British kind of follow that line too if they use these munitions. And I know the US did use a huge amount of it in Iraq, especially in the Gulf War and also after the invasion. But they say they fired over 1 million of these shells during the Gulf War, and cancer rates really spiked in Iraq throughout the 1990s after that. So the decision to supply the ammunition sparked a furious reaction from the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin pledging on Saturday to retaliate by moving tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. The depleted uranium ammunition seen in the documentary is marked as inert, suggesting that it could be a replica. A blue and silver training shell is visible next to it, an expert told Declassified. So one thing about this too is that there was a U.S. soldier there, and this says that the presence of a U.S. soldier at the training session could escalate tensions further, as the White House denied sending its own depleted uranium stocks to Ukraine. So I guess the U.S. has denied it. Before, they wouldn't say when asked because the Bradley fighting vehicles could be equipped with this depleted uranium, and the White House said that they wouldn't say. They declined to comment, but now maybe they're denying it. But of course, it doesn't really matter because the British are sending it now. All right. So the next one here is Zelensky to clear out the an Orthodox monastery with police. So Ukrainian police in Kiev are preparing to evict Orthodox priests who are refusing to leave a historic monastery complex known as the Peshersk Lavra, or the Monastery of the Caves. So the effort is part of a broad crackdown on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church launched by the government of Zelensky. The UOC, so this is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It has historic links to Russia, but is the largest church in Ukraine. So that's the UOC. And this church has more parishes than the similarly named Orthodox Church of Ukraine. That's the OCU, which has no affiliation with Moscow. So in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the UOC denounced the war and they cut ties with Moscow. But the steps were not enough for Zelensky. Some UOC priests have been accused of collaborating with Russian troops, and now many are facing sanctions, criminal charges, and now eviction from this big monastery complex. So there's about 500 UOC priests and theologians and nuns living in this big monastery. And they've been given until Wednesday to leave, but say that they're not going anywhere. And one young monk told the Times of London that he will not leave unless he is forced to. He said that the Ukrainian police said that they would not use force to evict the priests, but only time will tell what they do when Wednesday comes. And, it's Wednesday in Ukraine now. So the news, if there is a violent eviction, we'll probably hear about it pretty soon. But we'll see, how this plays out. But, this is a serious crackdown against this church, and it's drawn a lot of condemnation. I know from the UN. I saw the Pope the other day offered to mediate between, the government and the Ukrainian church. Police and members of the Ukrainian Culture Ministry, they've been standing guard outside of this monastery for a week to keep an eye on what some people so some people are leaving the monastery, I guess, or they're removing things from it, and they're looking to make sure they're not removing anything, too valuable, I guess. So we'll see how this all plays out. All right, the next one here is some good news. Matt Gaetz introduces a bill to withdraw from Somalia. So this was on Tuesday. Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida introduced a war powers resolution that would direct President Biden to remove armed forces from Somalia. And this is co-sponsored by Representatives Paul Gosar, Republican from Arizona, and Anna Paulina Luna, who's a Republican from Florida. So this resolution would mandate the removal of all U.S. armed forces from Somalia, with the exception of embassy security, within 365 days of the bill being adopted. So they would have a year to get out. So the resolution is privileged, meaning that the House will have to vote on the measure within 18 legislative days. So the introduction comes after Gaetz grilled General Michael Langley, who is the head of U.S. Africa Command, about the pattern of the U.S. military training African coup leaders. So Gaetz said in a statement, quote, "The American people have extremely low confidence in our military leaders and their ability to assess their own efficacy. How do they expect Americans to believe their justification for occupying Somalia when they can't even determine who in their own training programs will lead a violent coup afterwards?" End quote. So earlier this month, the House voted down a Syria war powers resolution that was introduced by Gaetz. And when that was voted down, Gaetz said, "I'm going to do more." And here he is with Somalia. So Gaetz said, quote, "When the House debated my resolution to withdraw from Syria, both Republicans and Democrats argued the 2001 authorization for the use of military force against Afghanistan serves as a global permission slip for every neocon fantasy. They will argue the same for Somalia," end quote. So the 2001 AUMF, which was passed in the wake of the September 11th attacks for the invasion of Afghanistan, is used today to justify the U.S. war against al-Shabaab. And that group did not exist when this authorization first became law, yet that's what they used to wage war against them. So Rand Paul, last week, he introduced an amendment in the Senate to repeal this 2001 AUMF, but it failed pretty badly in a vote of only 9 people voted for it, 86 voted against. So the U.S. war against al-Shabaab in Somalia has escalated since President Biden ordered the deployment of up to 500 troops to the country in May 2022. The Biden administration recently vowed that it would increase support for the Mogadishu-based government. And this U.S.-backed government launched a major offensive against al-Shabaab last year, leading to more U.S. airstrikes, although AFRICOM has not reported any airstrikes so far in the month of March, which is good because it looked like things were really escalating this year, but then there's been a lull so far in U.S. airstrikes in March. I haven't seen any other reports from Air Wars or anything. So the last airstrike in Somalia that AFRICOM reported took place on February 21st. So the U.S. military, when it comes to al-Shabaab, they pretty much treat them as the biggest threat when it comes to these groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda. But it's widely believed, a lot of people have recognized that al-Shabaab does not have ambitions outside of Somalia. So they're not a global threat. And they were born out of a U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion of Somalia that was launched in 2006. And the group did not declare loyalty to al-Qaeda until 2012. And that was after years of fighting the U.S. and its proxies. So it's always important to keep that context in mind when you see, these AFRICOM leaders acting like al-Shabaab is this huge threat to the U.S. homeland. It's just not the case. And, one thing that's kind of struck me about the 2022 National Defense Strategy that the Pentagon put out, it outlines the biggest threats facing the U.S. And it didn't even mention al-Shabaab. It mentioned al-Qaeda, linked groups once, didn't specify al-Shabaab. And this is Somalia is a country that the U.S. is bombing, the most right now, consistently. So I think and AFRICOM's operations, we don't know what they're doing. There's no accountability. So that's why it's good to see Gaetz get on this, even though, this doesn't have a chance to pass, I don't think. I think we should still, kind of rally behind it, maybe make some calls when the vote gets close, get people talking about it. And hopefully the progressives get on board with it that got on board with the Syria vote, maybe some more. Maybe some of them will be like, hey, why are we letting Gaetz, out, be better than us on this issue? Somalia is facing a famine. The last thing they need is an expanded war. So, again, hopefully it just gets people talking, gets more attention on this severely underreported war. All right. The next one here, this new bill designed to ban TikTok would give the government sweeping powers to crack down on tech. So a bill introduced in the Senate designed to ban the video sharing app TikTok would give the Biden administration sweeping authorities to crack down on transactions between people in the U.S. and countries deemed foreign adversaries related to information and communication technology. So this bill, known as the Restrict Act, would authorize the Commerce Secretary to, quote, review and prohibit certain transactions between persons in the United States and foreign adversaries and for other purposes, end quote. So TikTok is not mentioned by name in the bill, but its introduction comes as Congress is looking to ban the app, which is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance. So the allegation is that since TikTok is Chinese owned, it's obligated to share user data with the Chinese government and can be used as a spying tool, similar to how the FBI and the NSA have backdoor access to data from Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and other US tech platforms. We know that thanks to the leaks released by Edward Snowden. TikTok's CEO denied the allegations when he was grilled by Congress last week and said that China had not asked the company to share American data. But there is still strong bipartisan support for banning TikTok, and the Restrict Act, which was led by Senator Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, it has 21 co-sponsors. It has a lot of support, including 11 Republicans and 10 Democrats. The White House has also expressed support for the bill. In a statement on March 7th, the day the legislation was introduced, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the White House applauds the effort. He said, quote, "We look forward to continue working with both Democrats and Republicans on this bill and urge Congress to act quickly to send it to the president's desk," end quote. So the Restrict Act would authorize Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo to take action against transactions between a person in the U.S. and a foreign adversary that she determines poses a risk to U.S. national security. Very broad and vague definitions, leaving a lot up to her, the Commerce Secretary. The bill names 6 foreign adversaries: China, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. But the legislation would allow Raimondo or whoever is the Commerce Secretary in the future, in coordination with the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, to designate any foreign government or regime as a foreign adversary. So this is, I mean, again, if you read this bill, I wanted to put, it took me a while to write this article because I was trying to put in quotes, what they were defining as things that they would take action against. But it's just so broad and vague. It's really just up to whatever the Commerce Secretary or, whoever else in the Biden administration decides. And a person who violates this act, or a person, or I guess an entity, could be fined up to $1 million or punished with up to 20 years in prison. The broad and vague definitions in the legislation caused a lot of people to wonder. There were rumors going around that this bill means that if you use a VPN, let's say in the future TikTok is banned and use a VPN to get around the firewall, you could be punished for that. And again, but reading the bill, that's not an outlandish thing to think. It could apply to that the way it's worded. It's really, really broad. And I've seen some people compare it to basically a Patriot Act for the internet. A spokesperson for Warner, again, who introduced the bill, insisted that the legislation wasn't designed to target individual users and pointed to the language that says someone, quote, "must be engaged in sabotage or subversion of American communications, technology products, and services, creating catastrophic effects on U.S. critical infrastructure, or interfering in or altering the result of a federal election in order to be eligible for any kind of criminal penalty," end quote. But it is very broad. And, election interference, what does that even mean anymore? That's such a broad, vague thing that basically this is going to give the Commerce Secretary this authority to judge what is considered sabotage or subversion or any of the other threats, so-called threats. And of course, this has grave implications for civil liberties, and it could be used against any individual or tech or media company that the Biden administration or any future administration would want to target. This is a serious authority that they're trying to get through. And of course, it has all this bipartisan support. So hopefully more people realize how bad this bill is. And the whole TikTok thing, I mean, this is what always is going to happen. You have people making all these claims about TikTok, wanting the government to ban it. Of course, it's totally against, I think, our First Amendment, and it's going to lead to more government, overreach when it comes to banning apps. Okay, so they ban TikTok. Let's say there's another app or social media site that they don't like, and they could just make things up, as we know from all these Twitter files about Russia being involved in, let's say, Rumble or something like that, one of these new video platforms and then just decide, oh, we got to ban it. That's what I think this could set up. All right, the next one here. China is willing to sign a Southeast Asian nuclear treaty. So Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang has pledged that Beijing is willing to become the first nuclear-armed state to sign a treaty that makes Southeast Asia a nuclear weapons-free zone. So the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN, are signatories to a 1997 treaty that bans nukes in the region. Under the treaty, the ASEAN states pledged, quote, not to develop, manufacture, or otherwise acquire, possess, or have control over nuclear weapons, station or transport nuclear weapons by any means, or test or use nuclear weapons, end quote. So Qin made the pledge on Monday during a meeting with Cao Kim Horn, who is the Secretary General of the ASEAN. Qin said, quote, China is willing to take the lead in signing the protocol to the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty and advocate with the ASEAN for solidarity and win-win cooperation to safeguard regional security and stability, end quote. So Chinese President Xi Jinping said back in 2021 that he would sign the treaty a few months after the US, Britain, and Australia signed the AUKUS military pact that will provide Canberra with nuclear-powered submarines. So Qin's pledge comes about 2 weeks after the US, Britain, and Australia, they unveiled their big plans for AUKUS. The US is going to sell Australia some submarines, and the British will, with the ultimate goal of Australia making their own nuclear-powered submarines. So according to the South China Morning Post, China's offer to sign the treaty is an effort to counter AUKUS and other U.S. efforts to build blocks against China in the region. Also on Monday, Cao had a separate meeting with Wang Yi, who is senior to Qin and is or maybe I think Q when you're reading Chinese is really like a ch, like chin. Anyway, sorry. So Wang Yi is actually China's top diplomat. He's Secretary of State Antony Blinken's counterpart. And he met also with the Secretary General of the ASEAN, and he criticized the U.S. efforts to build up against China in the region. He said, quote, we must maintain the peaceful development environment that we have jointly created over the past decades, resolutely resist the Cold War mentality, and oppose attempts to create confrontation between major powers and camps, end quote. So China and 4 ASEAN members have overlapping claims to the South China Sea, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia. Beijing wants to establish a code of conduct with these states to handle issues in the disputed waters without interference from the U.S. All right, the last one here. The deputy foreign ministers of Syria and Turkey will meet in Moscow. So this is according to a report from Reuters. And it says the deputy foreign ministers of Syria, Turkey, Russia, and Iran will meet in Moscow in April as part of an effort to normalize ties between Damascus and Ankara. An unnamed senior Turkish official told Reuters that the meeting will be held on April 3rd and April 4th, and it's expected to be a continuation of the ministerial level meetings that began during what this official called the normalization process. So Turkey sounds pretty optimistic that this will lead to normalization, although this official said that significant decisions are not expected to be made because the meeting is being held on the deputy level. The talks will build on a meeting between Syria and Turkey's defense ministers that was hosted by Russia in December 2022, marking the first time the two countries held talks at that level since 2011. A normalization deal between Syria and Turkey would be a huge breakthrough, as Ankara was a major supporter of the failed regime change effort against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Turkey still occupies areas in northern Syria, and Assad has told Russia that any deal must involve a Turkish withdrawal. More and more regional countries are accepting that Assad is not going anywhere and are upgrading their ties with Damascus. Reuters reported last week that Saudi Arabia and Syria have agreed to establish ties and reopen their embassies. And these steps could happen after Eid al-Fitr, which is a Muslim holiday that is going to be celebrated this year on April 21st and the 22nd. So, of course, the U.S. is opposed to any countries upgrading ties with the Assad government and reaffirmed that position in response to the news of the potential Syria-Saudi normalization. I asked the State Department about that news, what, if they're still opposed to uh, Syria normalizing, and they got back to me over the weekend and said, this is a State Department spokesperson, said, quote, "Our stance against normalization remains unchanged. We will not normalize with the Assad regime, nor will we encourage others absent authentic and enduring progress toward a political solution," end quote. So that basically means progress toward regime change. Again, these countries in the region are just accepting that Assad's not going anywhere. And that's just the reality. And this could lead to the US being kind of not really having an option but to leave Syria. Because one thing with Turkey, so Turkey's in northern Syria, and they fight with the Kurds a lot, the SDF that the US backs. And now the SDF wasn't happy with the US response the last time that Turkey bombed that area in Syria. And they talked to, I believe they sent a delegation to Damascus, and they talked to the Syrian government. And one idea that they have is to integrate the SDF, the US backed forces, with the Syrian Arab army, and then deploy the Arab soldiers on the border. So then Turkey would be happy that the Kurdish forces aren't on the border, and they would withdraw. So the big thing standing in the way of a deal like that is the US. So, if the US just gets out of there, things can work themselves out. So that talking point that the US would be abandoning the Kurds is just nonsense. But that's it for the news for today. You can go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder, Vladimir Putin versus the International Criminal Court, one from Ronald Ensweiler, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine, and one from Caitlin Johnstone, U.S. is the leader because it says so, one from Peter Van Buren, Memories from Baghdad, and the spotlight is from Aaron Mate. New OPCW report covers up Duma's unsolved deaths. He just testified in front of the UN Security Council on the Duma OPCW cover up, the gas attack in 2018 or alleged gas attack, I should say, that the U.S. blamed on Syria and bombed Syria over. But whistleblowers from the OPCW have come out saying that the investigation wasn't right on it, and that they ignored these whistleblowers. But go check that out. That's everything. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Share it around. Tell your friends about it. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.